I think before I begin my talk proper, I just want to give a little bit of context to what I'm going to say today, because what I'm presenting this evening is very much new research and work in progress, but it relates to a study, a kind of bigger study that I started back in 2017. And that was a technical study on the Black Prince's effigy. And that was a study that I undertook. It was a kind of transatlantic partnership. So I did that alongside Emily Pegues from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC, and also a specialist metals conservator called Graham MacArthur from UCL. And I won't kind of go into detail about that study now, but if you're interested in what we discovered about the Black Prince's effigy, how it was made and his armor, there are some YouTube films kind of documenting us up scaffolding, looking at the monument, conducting the study. And also there's I've got it here, there's a kind of publication in the Burlington magazine that details what we found. But essentially, kind of that study led me to an unexpected place, which was the Black Prince's very unusual epitaph. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. So this was the kind of unexpected new place that technical study led me to. And I'm really looking forward to sharing my sort of brand new thoughts on this aspect of the Black Prince's tomb. So I'm going to share my slides now. So my talk this evening is called Epitaphs, Visibility and the Mobile Spectator at Canterbury Cathedral. So Edward of Woodstock, also known as the Black Prince, was Edward III's eldest son and heir, hero of Crécy, military commander at the battles of Poitiers and Nájera, and self-styled paragon of chivalric valour. He dictated his will and testament from his deathbed in the Palace of Westminster on only the very day before he died. He probably died of dysentery, and he wasn't yet 46 years old. He left as his heir the future Richard II, who was then aged only 9, and he succeeded only 1 year later when Edward III, his grandfather, died in 1377. Now, unusually for a Plantagenet royal monument, aside from that will, that sort of deathbed will, there are no other known surviving records or accounts relating to the construction of the Black Prince's tomb. But the will itself contains extraordinarily detailed instructions for the monument. And this is probably because the Black Prince hadn't at that point laid down any other written instructions or plans. So the will needed to be extraordinarily detailed because it was going to be the only kind of document at that point relating his wishes for his tomb. So what does the will say? Well, first, the Black Prince asked to be buried in the chapel of Our Lady Undercroft in Canterbury Cathedral, where he'd founded a chantry. His choice of Canterbury over Westminster Abbey, which by that date was the burial place of Edward III and Edward I, as well as housing the shrine of Edward the Confessor, represented a departure from kind of standard Plantagenet royal funerary preference. But, and I'll come back to this earlier, although they respected his decision to be commemorated at Canterbury, whoever was responsible for kind of executing the Black Prince's wishes actually overrode his request for burial in the crypt and instead moved his monument to the south side of the Trinity Chapel. And this decision had really important implication for the epitaph too, for its audience, for its visibility and its layout. And as I said, I'll come back to this later. So on the slide I'm showing you now, here is the chapel of St Mary Undercroft that the Black Prince had already prepared for his monument. And this is where he asked to be buried, probably directly before the altar here. And it's a really kind of magnificent chapel, ornately carved and with really beautiful wall paintings on the vault. And the kind of dimensions of the monument as he dictates them really precisely fit in this space. So we can be very certain that he had kind of choreographed this space very particularly for his tomb, but it was in the end not actually erected here. So returning to the Black Prince's will, what else does he ask for? Well, next, the Black Prince specified a tomb chest in marble. He asked for it to be of good masonry. He asked for 12 large brass shields showing his coat of arms and his badge of ostrich feathers. And he asked for scrolls above the ostrich feathers surmounted by his motto, Humon, which probably comes from the German meaning high spirits. And he asks on top of this chest to be placed what he calls a table of gilt brass to support his effigy, which he also asked to be made of gilt brass. So for the effigy itself, he asked that the effigy should be, and I'm quoting now, an image in relief of gilt brass in memorial of us, fully armed in plate of war, with our quartered arms and half the face exposed, with our leopard helm set beneath the head of the image. So in other words, clad in full armour, blazoned with the quartered arms of France and England, with half of his face exposed, and his head resting upon his helm, surmounted by the royal leopard crest. The Black Prince then dictates his lengthy and very unusual French epitaph word for word. And even more unusually, he specifically asked for the inscription to be set out on the monument in such a way as it could be most easily read and seen. So this is the quote from his will that I'm particularly interested in this evening. So he says, "And I wish that the following be written on my tomb, laid out in such a way as it might be most easily read and seen." And then, as I said, he dictates this lengthy 14-line French epitaph word for word. So this stipulation in the will reveals the importance to the Black Prince of his epitaph's location and visibility. But these aspects of his inscription have so far been overlooked. Previous scholars have focused entirely on the text's literary qualities. It's a striking statement on the transience of wealth, the inevitability of death, and the abject condition of his corpse. In my short lecture this evening, I want to redress the balance by interrogating the relationship between epitaph and monument much more closely. I'll explore the significance of the arrangement of the inscription on the tomb chest. And I'll argue that despite being one poem, different sections of the epitaph were actually intended to address different audiences. I'll also examine this disjunction between the presentation of the Black Prince in text and image, including the irony of an epitaph that laments the passing of riches, itself being made from gold. In exploring what we can learn by seeing and reading the epitaph of the Black Prince, I want to make a broader argument about the vital role of inscriptions in the visual rhetoric of medieval funerary monuments. So what I'm really interested in about this inscription is how embedded it is into the experience of viewing the monument itself, and how we can't read this text divorced from the sculpture. We need to understand it in situ as part of the sculpture. So many years elapsed between the Black Prince's death and the realization of the extraordinary detailed instructions he set down for his monument. As I mentioned before, there is no other known surviving documentary evidence relating to the tomb of the Black Prince. So it is impossible to say for sure exactly when it was erected and who oversaw its construction. But our technical study added to the weight of stylistic and other circumstantial evidence that suggests that the tomb was made as a pair with the monument to Edward III in Westminster Abbey. And that tomb is documented as being made after 1386. So one of the things that our technical study revealed is that the composition of the copper alloy that the prince's tomb was made from is almost identical to the metal that Edward III's effigy is made from. Far, far more similar than any other metal effigies in Westminster Abbey. So this really strongly suggests it was made by the same workshop at around the same time. And that places it after 1386, because we know that Edward's tomb was erected after 1386. So this means that more than a decade separates the tomb's manufacture and installation from the instructions that the Black Prince set down on his deathbed. And a later dating also places the Black Prince's monument firmly in Richard II's majority. And it suggests that it was the Black Prince's son and heir who enacted his father's testamentary wishes. And crucially, that it was Richard II who made the decision to cleave extremely closely to some of his deathbed requests, while at the same time radically altering or ignoring others. And this mixture of kind of fidelity and disregard for the Black Prince's instructions can also be seen in the treatment of the Black Prince's epitaph. So the epitaph itself is mounted on a chamfered upper edge of the chest, and gilded brass strips bear the text in 2- and 4-line registers of Gothic textura quadrata lettering. The letters themselves are punctuated by single ostrich feathers and by veined fig leaves and vines. There are 4 lines of text at his head and 2 lines of text on the other 3 sides of the tomb. The letters themselves are large, and the script is clear with very few abbreviations, meaning that the epitaph is easy to read, as he instructed. And the fillet behind the lettering has been filled with a hatched pattern, so that the gilded letters originally would have shone out clearly from the dull background. Only very, very slight differences in spelling distinguish the epitaph on the tomb from the text dictated by the Black Prince in his will. So essentially, it recreates what he stipulates in his will almost precisely. But there is one major difference. Sorry, wrong slide. The addition of another extra self-contained text on the west side of the tomb, directly behind the head of the effigy. And this kind of additional text is a much more conventional epitaph. It lists the Black Prince's genealogy and titles, his date of death, and asks for prayers for his soul. It's likely that the designers of the tomb decided to include this extra epitaph precisely because the one requested by the Black Prince lacked any of the typical identifying information found on tomb inscriptions, which was intended to aid in the reciting of personalized prayers for the soul of the deceased. In fact, the epitaph dictated by the Black Prince was not a bespoke composition for his tomb. It doesn't anywhere name him specifically. It's actually a French verse translation of a Latin epitaph from the Disciplina Clericus, which is a 12th century collection of morality tales. So on this slide, I'm showing you the added epitaph. So this is the epitaph that the Black Prince didn't request, the kind of standard one that was added in 4 lines behind his head at the western end of the tomb. So here lies the noble prince, my Lord Edward, eldest son of the most noble King Edward III, sometime Prince of Aquitaine and Wales, Duke of Cornwall and Earl of Chester, who died on the Feast of the Trinity, 8th of June, in the year of our Lord, 1376. May God have mercy on his soul. Amen. So all of the standard kind of information that we're used to seeing on epitaphs accompanying medieval tombs. So names, titles, the date of death, linking it to an important religious feast, and asking kind of for prayers for his soul. Here, I'm showing you a transcription of the French that the Black Prince actually requested in his will. And this is the epitaph that's on the north, south and east sides of the tomb. And I'm about to read to you a new English translation that I published in the Burlington magazine with Edward Mills. So before, there weren't any transcriptions or translations of the epitaph as it actually appeared on the tomb. They were all based on the this 12th century collection of morality tales that I mentioned. But in the Burlington, one of the things I wanted to do is record the epitaph as it actually appears on the monument itself. So here's the English translation of the French text that you can see on the screen now. So it begins, "You who pass by here with a closed mouth, where this body rests, listen to what I will say to you in the manner I know to say it to you. Such as you are, I used to be. You will be such as I am. On death, I did not ponder at all for as long as I was alive. On earth, I possess great wealth with which I kept great splendor, lands, houses, and great treasure, cloth, horses, silver, and gold. But now I am poor and wretched. Deep in the ground I lie. My great beauty is all gone. My flesh is wasted away. My dwelling is most cramped. I speak nothing but the truth. And if you were to see me now, I do not think that you would say I had ever even been a man, so utterly changed am I now. For God's sake, pray to the celestial King that he might have mercy on my soul. All who will pray to God for me or commend me unto God, may God place them in his paradise, where none can be wretched. The sentiments expressed in the epitaph, bodily decay, the fleeting nature of wealth and power, the utter dependence of the dead on prayers from the living, were common to the so-called macabre literature of the 14th century, such as the popular tale of the free living and the free dead. And in the later 14th and 15th centuries, similar sentiments are often found on the epitaphs accompanying transy tombs. These are monuments that juxtapose an idealized effigy of the dead atop the tomb chest, with a second depiction of a rotting corpse below. One notable example is the transy tomb of Archbishop Henry Chichely, made shortly before 1426, and situated just a few meters away from the tomb of the Black Prince in the northeast transept of Canterbury Cathedral. Like the epitaph to the Black Prince, the inscription on Chichely's tomb describes the transience of worldly station and the disintegration of his body. So here's just an extract from it. I was a pauper born, then to primate here raised. Now I am cut down and served up for worms. You will be like me after you die, horrible in all things, dust, worms, vile flesh. However, there's a very different relationship between text and image on the monument to Chichely compared to the monument of the Black Prince. On Chichely's monument, as would become typical for double-decker transy tombs, the monument reinforces and dramatizes the epitaph, depicting him on the upper slab as an archbishop in splendid robes, and on the lower slab as a naked, rotting corpse. But there is nothing macabre about the effigy of the Black Prince. The gilded brass figure, a material specified by the Black Prince in his will, appears beautiful, impervious to decay and decomposition, creating the impression of an eternally perfect knightly body. But in contrast, the speaker in the inscription describes himself as poor and wretched, lying in a cramped dwelling deep in the ground, his flesh rotted and wasted away. So just to return to this description, if we imagine the epitaph as the Black Prince speaking about himself, which I think is the only way to read it on the tomb, he's describing himself, but now I am poor and wretched, deep in the ground I lie. My great beauty is all gone. My flesh is all wasted away. My dwelling is most cramped. So there's a fundamental contradiction between the textual and visual depictions of the Black Prince. And one effect of this dissonance may have been to prompt the imagination of the viewer, encouraging them to reconcile epitaph and monument by imagining the Black Prince's concealed corpse. And this imaginative journey into the grave may have been prompted by the fact that the speaking subject in the epitaph specifically describes himself as hidden from sight. So he laments, "If only you could see me now." And this is precisely the kind of encounter described in a Middle English poem entitled The Disputation Between the Body and the Worms, which is part of a miscellaneous collection of devotional poems made for a Carthusian monastic community in northern England in the late 15th century. In the disputation, the anonymous narrator wanders into a church to pray during a plague season. But as he kneels in front of a devotional image, his eye and mind wander to a newly erected tomb of a noblewoman. Interestingly, for our purposes, he's particularly entranced by her beautiful gilded metal effigy. While looking at the tomb, he enters a dreamlike state, where he imagines a gruesome encounter between the woman's rotten corpse and the worms which are in the process of devouring her flesh. Importantly, the poem makes it clear that the monument which inspired this vision was not a transy tomb. And you can see this as well in the image that forms a frontispiece to the poem. And this is the illumination that I'm showing you on this slide here. What we're seeing is not a monument designed to reveal a sculpted corpse, but a standard funerary monument that's kind of hovering uncertainly in space above an open grave. So the dramatic tension of this poem actually relies on the opposition between the seductive beauty of the visible effigy versus the horror of the concealed but imagined corpse. Oh, and I just couldn't resist showing you this later marginal image of the woman's corpse wearing a beautiful butterfly headdress in conversation with the worms. So returning to the monument of the Black Prince, the dissonance between epitaph and effigy is precisely what hammers home the idea of ruinous loss and decay. The viewer looks upon the perfect effigy of the Black Prince while imagining his rotten corpse concealed in the grave directly below. So in this sense, we can imagine the monument and epitaph working together as a sort of imaginative transy tomb. When we delve further into the epitaph, other tensions between image and text emerge. The section on the north side of the tomb ends with a lament for everything I'll start again. The section on the north side of the tomb ends with a lament for everything that the deceased once held in his lifetime, all of which has now been lost to the ravages of death. On earth I possess great wealth, with which I kept great splendour, lands, houses, and great treasure, cloth, horses, silver, and gold. Although the purpose of the list in the epitaph is to emphasise the vanity and transience of earthly possessions, when read alongside the monument, this recitation of wealth also acts as a kind of memorial to the material splendour of the prince, whose court in Aquitaine was famous for its elegance and grandeur. And moreover, the great treasure, whose loss is lamented in the epitaph, would actually have been immediately present to those viewing the monument. So our technical study revealed that areas of the effigy were originally silvered as well as gilded. So this means that silver and gold are literally the precious metals from which the effigy is made. So the epitaph is lamenting the loss of the prince's silver and gold, but the prince's effigy itself is literally made from silver and gold. His cloth would have been present too, in the tapestry that the Black Prince bequeathed to Canterbury in his will, decorated with the badges of the Black Prince and swans with women's heads. He specifically instructed that this tapestry should hang on his tomb, and traces of its former presence can still be seen in a series of iron hooks that run alongside the north side of his tester. So they're very difficult to see, but they still appear in intervals between the lion's head, just on the north side of his tester. So we assume that this is where the tapestry would have hung from. Oh, here we go. I've given you another image here. So here are some of the iron hooks. Even the horses mentioned in the epitaph would have been evoked by the armorial achievements of the prince, which hung on an iron bar directly above the monument, the glittering gold and grand accoutrements of a royal knight on horseback. So here's the iron bar, and the achievements that you can see hanging above it today are modern reproductions, but we still have the original achievement. So here I'm showing you his original gauntlets here. really remarkable survivals. And we know that this arrangement of the achievements is how they were shown in the Middle Ages, because we have 16th century drawings of them displayed in this way. So we're pretty sure that this is the way that they were displayed, broadly speaking, in the 14th century too. So the great treasure lamented in the epitaph was actually still very much present on the monument itself: gold and silver, cloth, horses. And in this setting, the macabre aspects of the epitaph take on the quality of kind of ostentatious humility. Laments for the loss of worldly goods, when juxtaposed with the actual material splendor of the monument, become a way of recording those possessions for posterity. In his study of macabre literature, Ashby Kinch termed this effect ostentatious humility, as I just described. And he characterized descriptions of bodily debasement and the loss of power as mere momentary hiccups in a larger visual buffet of overindulgence. Rather than undermining the position of the wealthy and powerful, he argues, such insincere statements of humility were a sophisticated strategy which allowed the powerful to trump their own achievements while avoiding accusations of pride or superficiality. So this brings us to the question of audience, I think. Who were the intended and actual viewers of the tomb and its epitaph? So as I mentioned earlier, the tomb of the Black Prince breaks with Plantagenet convention, as it's located not Westminster Abbey, but at Canterbury Cathedral. And in his will, as I said, the prince asked for his tomb to be located in his chapel in the crypt, but whomever oversaw the actual erection of the tomb, most likely Richard II, decided to overrule this request and instead have the monument constructed in the south ambulatory of the Trinity Chapel, adjacent to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. So here I'm showing you a floor plan of Canterbury Cathedral. This small red box here shows you the location of the Black Prince's tomb. And here, this kind of larger yellow box is the original location of Becket Shrine, which of course was destroyed in the English Reformation. So this move from crypt to Trinity Chapel placed the memorial directly on the pilgrimage route for one of the most important and popular shrines in medieval Europe. Pilgrims would have encountered the monument as they made their way up the south ambulatory to access the shrine. So here in dark yellow, I'm showing you the kind of probable pilgrimage route, the most likely route that pilgrims would have taken in the later Middle Ages to access the shrine. And this is based on work that John Jenkins and a team at the University of York recently did in relation to kind of reconstructing pilgrimage at Canterbury Cathedral. I say the route that most pilgrims would have taken, because one of the things that John Jenkins emphasizes is that when you look closely at the sources, it seems that there was a kind of route for common pilgrims, and then there were various kind of additional places or variations on that route that you could take if you were a kind of particularly noble or distinguished pilgrim to the shrine. But this is the kind of standard route to the shrine, and you can see how the tomb of the Black Prince sits squarely on that route. And interestingly, receipts from the shrine show that after the Black Prince's death and his burial at Canterbury, donations to the shrine actually increased. So there's evidence that the Black Prince's burial and perhaps also later his monument were a significant kind of tourist attraction in themselves in the 14th century. So the move from crypt to shrine allowed for far greater access to the Black Prince's monument, but this greater access also came with associated problems. In the later medieval period, the need to control the crowds of pilgrims meant that the route to Becket Shrine was very carefully orchestrated, and the movement between different parts of the cathedral was strictly regulated for a system of railings and locked gates. And by the early 15th century, railings enclosed the entire area of the central shrine, and additional railings were added to protect the monuments sometime before 1426. So here I'm showing you a digital reconstruction that was part of this project at the University of York that I just mentioned, the Becket story. So this is a digital kind of reconstruction of the Trinity Chapel as it would have appeared in around 1408. So here you can see the shrine itself with the shrine altar. Here you have the railings that kind of entirely enclose that central shrine area now. They posit kind of two entrances to the shrine, one immediately to the west of the Black Prince's tomb and then one on the opposite side of the ambulatory. This is the Black Prince's monument. And as you can see, they're showing it at this date already enclosed with railings as well. So all of these railings means that it would have been impossible to walk around the monument to the Black Prince. Instead, pilgrims would have encountered the north side, the ambulatory side, first, perhaps followed by the south side after they were granted access to the shrine. The east and west sides would have been very difficult to see because the railings actually cut across these sides of the tomb. I'll show you a diagram of this so it's clear in a second. But the designers of the monument seem to have been aware of these restrictions on movement and actually cleverly arranged the epitaph to take advantage of the different audiences and choreograph movement through the Trinity Chapel. So here I'm showing you a diagram of the tomb that I've made. And what this shows is you have the monument in the middle. This red dotted line represents the iron railings. So you can see how they entirely enclose the tomb. And they also, the railings that block off the shrine area, so that link the tomb to the piers, they bisect the east and west ends of the monument. So this is what makes those parts of the tomb particularly difficult to see. The text on each side shows you the part of the epitaph that appears on each side of the tomb. So here you can see the epitaph kind of as it's laid out in space. So the first thing to note is that the arrangement of the epitaph means that each side can be read as a self-contained unit. So there's no need necessarily to walk around the monument to understand each part. So you read it, this is the first part of the epitaph, the second, the third, but they all read as kind of self-contained text. The second thing to note is that variations in the number of abbreviations in different parts of the epitaph imply that the designers deliberately arranged different segments of text to address different audiences. So they seem very keen to fit a certain chunk of the text on a certain side of the tomb. And sometimes this means they have to kind of stretch the text out a bit. And sometimes this means they have to kind of suddenly abbreviate it a great deal to get to the end. But they clearly have a very specific idea on which verses should appear on which part. So for instance, the text on the most public side, facing the route used by pilgrims, is the part that enumerates the prince's wealth, and it ends with the lament for his great splendour and the list of possessions that we explored earlier. It's likely, I think, that many of those who encounter the monument would only have read the south side of the epitaph, leaving them with a strong impression of the prince's great wealth, but without the more gruesome details of his bodily decay that are found on the east and south sides. The epitaph on the south side, this part here, which emphasises the prince's abject position and his utter dependence on God, face the shrine of Becket. And we might understand this part of the epitaph as an address directed to the saint himself. It would also be much more visible to the Benedictine monastic community at Canterbury, who accessed the shrine area from the north and would have spent far more time in this most sacred area of the church than the crowds of pilgrims approaching from the south. Depending on the length of the tapestry bequeathed by the Black Prince, it's also possible that the inscription on the north side was actually entirely concealed by textiles for at least some of the time. so it may not have always even been visible from the shrine area. So when we consider how the epitaph is embedded within the monument and its location in the Trinity Chapel, we can see how different verses were accessible from different viewpoints and therefore address different audiences. The most macabre verses were not visible from the pilgrimage route, but rather only accessible from within the shrine itself. Now, it's important to note that this arrangement could not have been foreseen by the Black Prince when he laid down the instructions in his will, because he asked for his tomb to be in an entirely different place. Instead, it must have been directed by Richard II when he oversaw the erection of the tomb. Perhaps Richard, who when commissioning his own tomb chose an epitaph stressing his quasi-saintly status, felt that the more macabre aspects of his father's inscription lacked the appropriate decorum that should be associated with the royal body, and were therefore better directed towards a largely monastic audience. The extraordinarily rich documentary and material evidence surrounding the epitaph of the Black Prince offers a rare opportunity to consider in detail how the significance of a funerary text may have been nuanced by the visual rhetoric of the monument and the spatial practices of the church in which it's located. As I mentioned before, the epitaph itself was not composed for the tomb, but when placed in juxtaposition with the material splendour of the monument, its verses would undoubtedly have taken on new resonances. And in part, we should credit the Black Prince himself for setting up this dynamic, as the monument and epitaph follow so closely the very detailed instructions he laid down in his will. But what the Black Prince did not ask for and cannot have foreseen was the decision to override his request to be buried in the crypt and instead locate his tomb next to Becket's shrine. This choice, probably made by Richard II, embedded the epitaph within the highly orchestrated and regulated movements surrounding the shrine of one of Europe's premier saints. It offered the opportunity to tailor the epitaph for different audiences, presenting pilgrims in the ambulatory with a more laudatory message, while reserving the more humble and pious verses for the Benedictine monks within the shrine area. As I mentioned at the beginning, my investigation of this epitaph is still a work in progress. And one aspect that I haven't had the chance to investigate yet is this here. So you might just see on the western pier, adjacent to the Black Prince's monument, there's this sort of ghost rectangle. And here I'm showing you a kind of close-up of what actually appears in this ghost rectangle. So there are traces of polychromy. So there's a kind of green background with white and black line dividers and Gothic lettering. So it appears to have been a painted inscription. With close examination of this polychromy under raking and UV light, we may be able to determine whether this painted inscription is in some way related to the epitaph of the Black Prince. Is it possible that at some later date, part or all of the epitaph was copied onto the column to make up for the difficulties in reading posed by all these railings? If so, this may represent another later attempt by the Canterbury community to remain faithful to the Black Prince's stipulation that his epitaph should be, in his own words, most easily seen and read.